Today, let's explore why the U.S. would want to take over Greenland, Canada, and the Panama Canal. The U.S. is an empire, and the current global system of exchange is a debt-based system of currencies, of which the U.S. dollar is chief. Before we go any further, we must understand the difference between money and currency. Money is a store of wealth. It has intrinsic value. It can always be used for exchange, no matter what the current political or economic situation demands. It is something that others will always want for varying reasons. This is why gold, for example, is money, as it can always be used as a medium of exchange, regardless of the situation. It can be used to store up generational wealth and in that way passed on. It can always be traded in for a new currency when an old one collapses. In other words, money sits above currency in hierarchy of order. In a debt-based system, it does not underpin the currency system of exchange. So currency, then, is what is made to be acceptable for trade. It is demanded for the payment of taxes, and it is enforced as acceptable for the purposes of trade by the political, economic, and militaristic power that underlies it. Currency, by its nature, is current, only acceptable so long as the underlying powers that enable and enforce its use are deemed credible. So currency, therefore, is a valuation placed upon labor, upon materials, and production as a whole. It is a measuring stick. This is why currencies measure against one another in the marketplace according to their perceived value and credibility. And so back to the original question of why would the U.S. want Greenland, Canada, and the Panama Canal? It should start to become apparent already where this is going. It is about the maintenance of empire, the projection of power, and the resultant dominance of the currency standard. It is also about war and the ability to not have it manifest in a hot manner, or at the least to stave off a hot war and push its manifestation further down the road. On that point, the whole question of Greenland, Canada, and Panama revolves around China. I will get to that shortly. We are at a crossroad in the world today when it comes to the question of currency and the viability and credibility of it. This is because it is debt-based rather than asset-based, and debt is at all-time highs. Keep in mind, money, as previously defined, is an asset. We are reaching a convergence point in the world today when it comes to the proliferation and adoption of technology to and by the masses. A convergence point in how it relates to currency, debt, and assets, and the fact that people, for the most part, have willingly adopted new digital technologies. Remember, currencies are current until they are not, and then replaced. When you look at the current dominant geopolitical player, the U.S., and its currency, the dollar, you will realize that the debt is currently not sustainable. The total debt, meaning personal, corporate, and government, is a very real problem that the empire needs to address if it wishes to continue on as the dominant empire. Debt today in the U.S. is roughly equal to asset holdings, and therefore puts the U.S. at a tipping point. This means that a strategic decision must be made. And this is where the Greenland, Canada, Panama play comes into the equation. For the U.S. to continue on in the debt-based system as the dominant player, it must expand the empire if it wishes to expand the debt and continue to print money, so-called, and raise the debt ceiling endlessly. One way to do this is to physically expand the empire and take over Greenland and Canada. The reason is simple. You take over resource-rich areas and new populations, and now you have those assets to hold up against new debt creation and the printing of more so-called money again, and get to do so without the constant worrying of raising the debt ceiling. Imagine the relief to Congress on that recurring issue, as you can now expend more currency into the marketplace because you have so much more natural resource value and units of production to support it. Greenland may not have very many people, but when you take over Canada, you get 40 million more people. Many of those are new units of production added to the balance sheet literally overnight. And so there is an economic advantage to taking over territories and people units. It adds to the balance sheet, and presto, you can carelessly print more currency for the next 20 years. Now, I did say we are at a crossroad, however. So what does that mean? Well, it means there is another option. And that option is where the convergence of the proliferation and acceptance of digital technologies enters the possible new equation. To choose not to physically expand the empire, you could rather go to a digital asset-based system that meshes with this inverted balance sheet of debt. You would simply take over all the assets, which, as I mentioned, roughly equal the debt. This would be done by registering and tokenizing all assets, then inserting them onto the balance sheet against the debt, and presto, now there is all that room yet again to expand money printing, so-called, and reboot the cycle. This would require the population to accept such a new system, where their assets would now be held with a claim against for the health and sustainability of the system, which in reality means your assets are no longer really yours and yours alone. This would also require the use of a digital payments system, which would be enforced as the acceptable standard for the payment of taxes. It would also be accompanied by a personalized digital identification system. Once again, this would have to be acceptable to the population beyond any reasonable doubt for it to be implemented. So let's now look at the question of war and pushing it off into the distance somewhat, or even pushing down the likelihood of it. Remember, the question of war revolves around China. Officials in the US and in China have in the past made statements that they believe war with one another is inevitable by the end of this decade. Some have said 2027, while others have said 2029 are the likely years for the kickoff of such hostilities. So if the U.S. wants to remain the dominant player on the world stage, it must keep China down. That's what taking over Greenland, Canada, and the Panama Canal is really all about. If you take over the Panama Canal, you shut China out of the control position it has over it right now. Operating a passageway like that is a profitable venture, as well as a policy control vector. When you control the shortcut between continents and oceans, you can exert political influence, ensure your currency is used for trade, and monitor and police all global trade activities. And of course, bring in a profit from it, to which you can uphold your currency position relative to the others. Now let's take a look at Canada, and talk about something Canadians don't even really know much about. It is the same situation in the northern waterways of Canada as is with the Panama Canal. It's called the Northwest Passage. It also is a shortcut between continents and oceans. It is becoming more navigable all the time, and Canada is uniquely positioned to profit off of this. Canadian politics is, as usual, an obstacle to such a venture, and it is not even on the average Canadian's radar about any of this. If you have a waterway shipping lane shortcut, you get to police it, control it, and profit from it. Just like with the control of the Panama Canal, you get to play a major role in international trade, the bolstering of your currency, and political influence. Canada is too caught up in internationalist environmental politics and domestic issues regarding local populations and their employment in new ventures, and the interplay that is imposed on those issues, though, to do anything much about this opportunity. Canada is too China-friendly for the U.S., and so if the U.S. took over Canada, this would simply become a new trade route, and the U.S. would reap the resultant benefits of such. In this situation, the U.S. can then control China shipping at both the northern and southern points of the continent and keep China in check. This, of course, has the potential to keep China down monetarily and in terms of external influence to the rest of the world in the physical sense. China, as the manufacturer to the world, must have an accompanying shipping access to the rest of the world. When you control that access, you get to exert political power over China. If the U.S. takes over Canada, they get 40 million new people added to the roll. As some are too young and others too old, not all are value added as units of production, but most of them are. This increases GDP and strengthens the domestic economy, and therefore your influence over the rest of the world through economic power and dollar dominance. Geophysically, taking over Canada more than doubles your land mass and directly connects Alaska with the other states. I think that President Trump wants the Ukrainian conflict with Russia to be over right away because he really would like to do in Greenland what President Putin did in the Donbass. This is where Putin told them if they vote to join Russia, he would accept that and offer them protections and enjoin them to Russia proper. I think President Trump would like to have Greenlanders vote also whether to join the U.S. and to bring them into the Union in the same manner. Remember, the U.S. has a history in Greenland also. To do this, he needs the Russia-Ukraine conflict to end peaceably. Greenlanders have the option to vote on their destiny, and it seems they may look favorably to joining themselves to the U.S. This, of course, is not something Mr. Putin would like, as this puts the U.S. directly in the polar region in a much more substantial and strategic way than it is currently. People need to realize that Russia has been very active in the Arctic for many years already, doing patrols, conducting expeditions, refurbishing bases, staking claims. There is a lot of resource value in the Arctic region that is yet to be exploited, and so there is a tremendous economic reason to be in the polar region in a big way. So if the U.S. took over Greenland, preferably by democratic vote, what would this mean for Canada? Well, it's like a scene from an old movie or cop show where they say, "Come out with your hands up, you are surrounded." If the U.S. takes Greenland, then Canada truly is surrounded. At that point, they have to decide what the response is going to be. They could either be taken by the U.S. by force, or acquiesce and negotiate accession into the Union, or they run the associated risks of joining the EU, or they could run the associated risks of joining BRICS, or they could just decide to remain defiant and remain independent and let the chips fall where they may. As I produce this, Canadians are too emotional in their response to the U.S. and go about wearing dark hats saying, "Canada is not for sale," in response to Trump's red hats. Interesting that these hats appear to be mostly dark in color, as usually the bad guys wear the black hats. Someone in the U.S. might say a dark hat is apropos, though, as darkness is associated with death. Is Canada dead? Should it join the U.S.? These are questions that need to be answered with reason rather than emotion. The most common response Canadians have always had regarding their identity is that we are not Americans. Again, that is an emotional response and does not define any identity that you do have. It doesn't help that Trudeau has said that Canada is a post-nation state, and Canadians voted for him 3 times. So all in all, this is an interesting time to be alive right now, no matter where you live, as the implications are truly global. So if the U.S. took Canada one way or another, as well as Greenland, this would be a huge strategic boon to the U.S. against Russia, just as it would be a huge economic advantage to keeping China in check. If you can economically keep China in check while boosting the empire and keeping Russia down, you can push back the inevitability of a hot war. War is expensive, which is why the spoils go to the victor. If you're going to be in war, you better win. These, I believe, are some of the major goals here, in addition to the monetary issues I already mentioned. When you look at the Earth itself, nations have a control over the seas that border them, typically extending as far as the continental shelf. With this in mind, let's take a look at the Earth below the waves. As you can see, Canada and the US sit on the same continent and have a contiguous continental shelf. If they assimilated, there would be no more issues regarding Arctic boundaries and policing responsibilities. There would be no more disputing over resource claims in the sea or differences in regulatory concerns. The Northwest Passage would likely soon open to global shipping traffic and be controlled, at least initially, by the Navy. Looking further out to Greenland, one could argue that it is also part of the North American continent and shares the same continental shelf. Although some would come out to argue against it, I think it's probably all right to believe your lying eyes in that case. Greenland really is part of North America. So with all of that said, what is the future? Will the US stay where it is and go digital, eliminate cash, and tokenize all assets, and continue the debt ceiling that way? Or will they physically expand the empire and carry on with cash by acquiring more resources and populations to write their future against? If they do nothing, the empire will feel the squeeze and lose control and pole position in the world, and truly may slip into an economic, political, and monetary demise, or even the abyss itself. As for the rest of the world, it must decide what version of the US it wants to see. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe, as this really helps a small channel, and I thank you so much. See you again next time.